It's been 3 years since Sony announced the original Sony ZV-1 vlogging camera, and since then it's been hailed as one of the best vlogging cameras on the market. So now there's a new kid on the block. There's a Sony ZV-1 Mark II, which just came out, and in this video, which is going to be filmed entirely on that camera, I'm going to go over 9 new features on this camera so you can make up your mind if this is the best camera for you or not. We'll also go over some cons because it's not a perfect camera. This video is not sponsored by anybody, but I do have this camera on loan, and if you do find this video to be helpful, then please consider using my affiliate links below to purchase your next set of gear. To get started, if you don't already know about this camera, then I'm going to talk about why it's a good vlogging camera to begin with. First of all, it takes a point-and-shoot form factor, which some people, myself included, consider to be more ergonomic when it comes to taking photos and videos. Speaking of, this is actually a really great hybrid camera because even though it is marketed as a vlogging and content creator camera, it can take some really great still photos as well. It can shoot up to 24 frames per second, 20 megapixel stills in JPEG or RAW. And it also comes with Sony's really great autofocus for objects and for humans. This camera is also pocket-sized and really lightweight, so in my opinion, it's a really good primary camera or a good complementary camera if you already have an iPhone or a GoPro as your main vlogging camera. So like I mentioned, the ZV-1 Mark II is largely unchanged from the ZV-1 in several ways. They are both really compact and lightweight. This camera weighs in at 292 grams. It also still has a 20.1 megapixel 1-inch sensor. And it still has the flip-out screen and the built-in microphone that comes with the little furry windscreen. There's also still the bokeh button that gives you a blurred out background at the push of a button, and the product showcase mode, which I love using a lot as a tech reviewer. So what exactly is new on the ZV-1 Mark II? To me, one of the best things about the ZV-1 Mark II is that it comes with a wider angle lens. So the original ZV-1 had the equivalent of about a 24 to 70 millimeter lens, which is great if you're like shooting mainly behind the camera, but if you ever want to be in front of the camera, then you really need something a little bit wider than that, especially since if you apply the built-in stabilization, that crops in even more to your frame. And so the ZV-1 Mark II now has an 18 to 50 millimeter equivalent lens. Now it does come with a couple of caveats. The first being that the overall aperture is a little bit slower, especially as you zoom in. So it's now at f1.8 to f4 aperture. So if you go all the way into 50 millimeters, it's going to be a little bit slower at f4, which is really only an issue if you're trying to shoot in low light. Now this camera does come with active stabilization, which in my opinion is actually pretty good at stabilizing my footage. But the thing is, it still does crop into your shot just a little bit, so even though it's optically 18 millimeters on the wide end, if you do apply active stabilization, then it's going to crop into about 23 millimeters, which is a little bit on the tight side, but honestly, if you're holding the camera on a mini tripod out at an arm's length, then I still think it's a pretty good focal range for vlogging. And it is still wider than the original ZV-1. Now, even though the zoom range on the ZV-1 Mark II is a little bit short compared to the original ZV-1, it's 50 millimeters as opposed to 70 millimeters. Sony cameras are really great because you can actually get more zoom out of this camera than you would think, because Sony lets you choose whether you're shooting in digital or optical zoom. So optical zoom is that 18 to 50 millimeter zoom that you're getting with the lens. But if you ever want to shoot in digital zoom, that gives you even more range. It does degrade your quality just a little bit, but if you really need the range, then it's a nice option to have. But even better, you can actually toggle on clear image zoom. It's really cool because it zooms into your shot without degrading the quality. So the quality of clear image zoom is about equivalent to that of optical zoom. And on this camera, you have a couple different options for toggling your zoom. There is the manual zoom toggle that you can use on top of the camera, or you can use the new touch screen on this camera to zoom in. And so that's one of the new upgraded features on the ZV-1 Mark II. It does have that flip out screen, but it is now a touch screen for controlling your settings like your zoom, and also to tap on your subject to enable autofocus tracking, which is really good in this camera. I mean, that's true for pretty much all Sony cameras that I've used. The autofocus is one of the biggest sellers. Now the ZV-1 Mark II does have a built-in 3-capsule microphone, which looks pretty identical to the original ZV-1 microphone, but this camera now has a microphone that is multi-directional instead of just directional. And so you can actually go into your settings and you can tell the camera to focus on the front, the rear, or all directions in terms of the mic sensitivity. or you can set it to auto. This is what it sounds like with the multi-directional microphone set to auto. So if I turn the camera around, and now I'm standing behind it, you should still be able to hear me pretty well. Microphone set to front. So since I'm in front of the camera, I should be picked up pretty well, but if I spin the camera around and now I'm standing behind it, then you should not be able to hear me too well. And now that microphone is set to rear, so this is what it sounds like if I'm standing behind the camera. And if I spin it around, this is what it sounds like if I'm in front of the camera. Also, this is not new in the camera, this is also present on the original ZV-1, but there is a 3.5mm microphone jack for connecting your own microphone, or it has the multi-interface shoe so you can attach a wireless Sony microphone if you choose. This camera also has multi-face recognition, so that means it will automatically adjust the aperture if there's a second or even third person in your frame. So that's really handy if you're not just vlogging by yourself and you have another subject joining you. Speaking of faces, the ZV-1 Mark II adds the new Cine Vlog mode, which debuted on the ZV-E1. This locks in an aspect ratio and a frame rate that mimics a classic movie vibe, and it also lets you change color filters. This can be ideal if there's a certain look and feel that you want in your video, and you want it to be shot in camera like this without having to fiddle in post-production. Another new addition to the ZV-1 Mark II is a USB-C port instead of the micro USB port that you found on the original ZV-1. I don't know about you guys, but this is a huge deal because I really don't use micro USB cables anymore. So the fact that I can now just have a USB-C cable to charge the camera, or I can actually live stream now by plugging in USB-C, or I can turn the ZV-1 Mark II into a webcam just by connecting it to my computer via the USB-C port and not having to install any software. Speaking of connectivity, the ZV-1 Mark II also allows you to connect to Sony's new Creator app, which is on smartphones, and so that lets you control the camera from your phone and also preview your images. You can also use the new shot mark feature in the camera if you want to pre-cut your video in camera before you export it, so you don't have to export a really long video file. And the final new thing about the ZV-1 Mark II that I think is worth mentioning is the fact that the bottom 1/4-20 tripod hole has now been moved. So on the original ZV-1, it was kind of in the center of the camera, and the problem with it is that the placement of that tripod hole blocked the door of the battery and the memory card slot. And so if you ever had your camera attached to a tripod, you would have to undo the entire thing in order to change your battery or access your memory card. And so that has been fixed on this camera, and that is a really big change in my opinion. So those are 9 new features about the ZV-1 Mark II that I think are pretty positive, but there are some cons. The first one is pretty big, and that is the price. So the original Sony ZV-1 was about $750 brand new. And now it's actually been discounted, so it's down to $700 if you get it new, or it's been out for so long that there's a lot of used copies on the market, and they can get pretty cheap, like down to $500-ish. The ZV-1 Mark II is quite a bit more expensive. It's nearly $900 if you buy it brand new. So yeah, it's a lot more money to buy this camera. The second downside is that even though this camera can shoot 4K, it only goes up to 4K 24 or 30 frames per second. There's no 60 frames per second option. And in my opinion, if I'm going to spend almost $900 in a camera, then I would want it to have 4K 60. So that's a bit of a miss. But with that said, I actually shoot like 75% of my footage in 4K 30 anyway. So it's not, the biggest deal, but I do wish that it had a 60 frames per second option. Another thing this camera is lacking is S-Cinetone, which I really like. It's one of the color profiles that you'll find on a lot of Sony's professional grade cameras, like my Sony a7 IV has it, and I love it because it just makes really nice skin tones and the colors are really natural. I don't really need to shoot in log and color grade my shots if I'm using S-Cinetone. But unfortunately, we don't have that on the ZV-1 Mark II, but you do have S-Log. So if you do want to shoot in log a flat profile and actually color grade your shots in post, that can be really helpful if you want more control over your dynamic range, or if you're shooting with another Sony Sony camera. You can shoot in S-Log with both cameras, and you can match your colors of the footage a little bit better this way. And the final con, in my opinion, is actually one that I'm facing right now, and that is the fact that the battery is unchanged. It's the same battery as the original ZV-1, which is small and compact, but the battery life just isn't the greatest. Like, I'm about to run out of battery on this camera as I'm shooting, and I really hope it doesn't happen in the middle of filming, but I do wish that the battery life was a little bit longer on this camera. So with all of that said, should you buy the new Sony ZV-1 Mark II? It's kind of a tough question. So if you own the original Sony ZV-1, I would say that it might be worth the upgrade if some of those physical limitations on that camera are really bothering you, like the micro USB port, the placement of the tripod hole, the fact that the lens isn't quite wide enough. Like, those things really have been improved on the new version of this camera. With that said, if you are using the original Sony ZV-1 and you're pretty happy with your workflow and the quality and just how it's going with that camera, then you don't necessarily need to upgrade. Now, if you're brand new to vlogging cameras and you don't already have something like the ZV-1, then this could be a really great option for you because, like I mentioned earlier, this is a really great hybrid camera, so it's good not only at shooting video but also still photography. If you have the budget, then I would definitely consider looking at the Sony ZV-1 Mark II, but if you don't have the budget, then you could also go for the original Sony ZV-1, which I did a video on recently about if it's worth buying in 2023 or not. Spoiler alert, my conclusion is yes, it is worth buying. So the original ZV-1 is still a really great camera, and it's now been discounted, and there's even used versions of it out there, so you can get it for a pretty affordable price. You could also wait a few months, maybe 3 to 6 months after the ZV-1 Mark II comes out, and then start looking at the used market to see if there are some cheaper versions out there, or maybe some sales come out to discount it a little bit more. But those are my opinions after testing out this camera. I do think it's a really great complement to something like an iPhone or a GoPro if you are using those as your primary vlogging cameras, or it could also be a really great primary vlogging camera if you're on the market for one. But let me know what you think in the comments below, leave me any questions, and as always, if you're in doubt, just shoot it.